The second female Prime Minister, but certainly not the last. I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
Brexit. Theresa May's downfall. Theresa May, the leader of the country that voted for Brexit, the leader at the time when the country was leaving the EU, and the Prime Minister who promised to leave the EU, but we still haven't left. From day one, she chose to sit on the fence.
Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it.
Delivered vague utterances about what she was going to do. It would be that said fence that would later impale her and lead this Prime Minister to her downfall. So what went wrong for May, and why is the Prime Minister crying in pity on the doorsteps of number 10? Even if you don't agree with me, consider subscribing by the end of the video.
We are living through an important moment in our country's history. Following the referendum, we face a time of great national change. And I know, because we're Great Britain, that we will rise to the challenge. As we leave the European Union, we will forge a bold, new, positive role for ourselves in the world. And we will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us. That will be the mission of the government I lead, and together we will build a better Britain.
It wasn't the chaos in the NHS, Windrush, Grenfell, Hawaii, or any other issue that led to Theresa May resigning, but Brexit. The 13th of July 2016 was when she took office. It took her a number of months just to trigger Article 50, and even then, she crossed her first stumbling block that meant she had to consult Parliament on the final deal because of a court ruling by the Supreme Court. This led her into a trap that ultimately led to her downfall. In Theresa May's world was a whole pile of work left over by previous Prime Ministers. ISIS terrorists created from an illegal war in Iraq, created from Blair's time in office.
Everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman that said she used to be Labour. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
A deficit created from Brown's time. The disgruntled communities left in tatters from David Cameron's austerity. The independence losers in Scotland. And finally, the divisions between Leave and Remain in one of the most divisive referendums this country ever saw. She had to deal with the most time-consuming part first and foremost. That was Brexit. But you could tell that the economy and the experience she'd had trying to recover it again after the economic crash was still foremost in her mind. Her Brexit approach was damage limitation. That's why she negotiated a transition period to ease the transition for businesses to change whatever it was the UK got from Brexit. So with the looming end date for the transition period coming after her scheduled time in office was due to be up, she called an election.
Our opponents believe, because the government's majority is so small, that our resolve will weaken and that they can force us to change course. They are wrong. They underestimate our determination to get the job done.
The polls at the time showed the Tories with a huge majority in front of Labour. UKIP had already delivered Brexit and weren't likely to steal any vote share from them. Scotland didn't seem as interested in independence, and so it looked like the SNP would disappear, and it all seemed ready for May to be able to rule the country and deliver Brexit with a huge majority in Parliament. But for the rest of us who looked at this, it was pretty easy to see that history tells us when the Tories rule for so long, Labour will eventually take over. When a Prime Minister takes office without being elected, they tend not to last too long. And when an opposition party comes up with anti-austerity policies and campaigns well, it will always win over some voters when the incumbent government happens to be the one who imposes that austerity. Add into the mix a mainstream media that was beset with phone hacking and paedophilia scandals, a parliament known to claim expenses illegally and vote for illegal wars, and the entire establishment known for avoiding tax, then it's no wonder the country once again said a massive FU to the woman trying to make her result inevitable. Didn't she learn that Brexit means you can't have inevitability anymore?
The choice at the election is clear. strong and stable leadership with me in the national interest, or a hung parliament and coalition of chaos under Jeremy Corbyn, which every single one of us will pay for, in higher taxes, fewer jobs, more waste and more debt. This will harm working families. That is too big a risk to take.
So she had to form a coalition with the DUP. In the months ahead, she did nothing to help her time in office, only to make herself look weaker. Boris Johnson, Jeremy Hunt, Philip Hammond, Chris Grayling, Amber Rudd, David Davis and Dominic Raab are all unpopular amongst different people for different reasons, and most of those cabinet members either resigned or had to be fired.
2 years to get to this point. Have you finally reached a deal that keeps everyone in your cabinet on side and your Brexiteers at the cabinet table?
Well, in detailed discussions today, the Cabinet has agreed our collective position on the future of our negotiations with the EU. And our proposal will create a UK-EU free trade area, which establishes a common rulebook on industrial goods and agricultural products. This will maintain high standards, but we will ensure that no changes can take place without the approval of our Parliament.
By the summer of 2017, she'd come up with the Chequers deal. This was the moment when the public could see that she'd fallen from her fence flat into a field. Not a field of wheat, but a field of Remain. Yes, she promised to deliver Brexit. Yes, she promised to leave the customs union and single market. But she was trying to get the UK to adhere to the European Court of Justice's ruling indefinitely by creating the Common Rulebook. There was no guarantee immigration would fall either, if businesses needed migrants, for example. There was no clear solution for Ireland yet, and it created many enemies, some of whom might be our next Prime Minister. But because Cabinet agreed the deal, she went on to negotiate it with the EU. It took ages to agree the deal, almost looking like it wouldn't be agreed by the 29th of March. But she did.
Last week, we achieved a decisive breakthrough when we agreed with the European Commission the terms for our smooth and orderly exit from the EU. Alongside that withdrawal agreement, we published an outline political declaration setting out the framework for our future relationship.
The deal she came up with contained the Irish backstop. It meant that Northern Ireland would remain within single market access, and the UK could remain in a customs union indefinitely if no solution to Northern Ireland could be found. Don't forget that this was on top of being overruled by the ECJ in the Common Rulebook and the £40 billion we had to pay to leave the EU. So unlike Chequers, which at least still had the promise to leave the customs union and single market, this made that promise conditional.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432.
So inevitably, her deal failed in Parliament. She faced numerous votes of no confidence and survived. She went back to the EU to try to add an end date to the backstop. They only offered an end date on the condition that an alternative could be found.
The ayes to the right, 242. The noes to the left, 391.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, I profoundly regret the decision that this House has taken tonight. I continue to believe that by far the best outcome is that the United Kingdom leaves the European Union in an orderly fashion with a deal. And that the deal we've negotiated is the best and indeed the only deal available.
So, without her voice, she lost the second vote. It was approaching the 29th of March, the date we were originally supposed to leave the EU, but we didn't have an agreed deal. Theresa May had the choice, whether to leave without a deal or to extend Article 50.
Well, I think this shows the strength of concern there is right across the House of Commons about the risks that the government might just drift, even by accident, into a damaging and chaotic no deal that would hit manufacturing and policing and security. And that's why I think this was a strong message to the government to make sure that doesn't happen.
With Parliament threatening to block the government if it chose to leave the EU without a deal, May had no choice but to choose a temporary extension till the 12th of April.
You, the public, have had enough. You're tired of the infighting. You're tired of the political games and the arcane procedural rows. Tired of MPs talking about nothing else but Brexit, when you have real concerns about our children's schools, our National Health Service, knife crime. You want this stage of the Brexit process to be over and done with. I agree. I am on your side. It is now time for MPs to decide.
It became clear to Theresa May that some people wanted to remain, others wanted to leave without a deal, others wanted some form of soft Brexit. So instead of guaranteeing any future trade relationship, she left it off the bill, in the hope that at least the bit she negotiated could finally be agreed.
The ayes to the right, 286. The noes to the left, 344.
The implications of the House's decision are grave. The legal default now is that the United Kingdom is due to leave the European Union on the 12th of April, in just 14 days' time. That is not enough time to agree, legislate for and ratify a deal, and yet the House has been clear it will not permit leaving without a deal. And so we will have to agree an alternative way forward.
She could have left the EU then, without a deal or called a second referendum. But with a divided party, a divided country, and 3 years of work to get to this point, she wasn't going to let go. The strong, stable, bloody difficult woman went into talks with Labour. He wanted a permanent customs union. She wanted to leave the customs union. They offered a temporary customs union, and they said no. So May was forced to face the public and admit another failure that would become, ultimately, her penultimate one.
I've also listened carefully to those who've been arguing for a second referendum. I've made my own view on this clear on many times. I do not believe this is a route that we should take, because I think we should be implementing the result of the first referendum, not asking the British people to vote in a second one. But I recognise the genuine and sincere strength of feeling across the House on this important issue. The government will therefore include in the withdrawal agreement bill, at introduction, a requirement to vote on whether to hold a second referendum. And this must take place before the withdrawal agreement can be ratified.
May wanted to offer all the same things she was going to compromise with Labour, including a second referendum, if they would have agreed to a deal. But her party said no. Her party don't want to put their names to something that they'd struggle to win a leadership contest by. Not only had May fallen into the Remainers' hands, but she'd fallen out with her own Tory party, fallen out with Parliament, who wouldn't agree a deal anyway, and eventually she fell out of office. Theresa May will be remembered as the appeaser, the betrayer, the busted flush, weak and wobbly. Some will say May was always a Remainer, some will say she was just a Tory. Some will have sympathy, others will forever hate her. But what's left with May is not just her form of Brexit, but her form of politician. Never again will this country put up with establishment cover-ups, failed deliveries and betrayals. May was never open, honest or trustworthy, and her form of Brexit was the epitome of that. It was something that she was desperately trying to spin to appeal to all parties. That's why both Labour and the Tories are both struggling to stitch together the divides of this country. People no longer trust political spin. Our future leaders have to accept that people don't sit on fences, the mob doesn't compromise, it wants results. Brexit has not yet been delivered, and even if you're a Remainer, you have to accept that a majority of people voted to leave the EU. That's a fact. It doesn't mean we shouldn't remain. It doesn't mean that a future Prime Minister shouldn't offer us a broad enough vote that informs the country how it wants its relationship with the EU to be, but it does mean that we voted leave, so that, by default, has to be acted on and delivered first. May failed because she didn't put leaving the EU first, even though it was front and centre of that 2017 manifesto. The public saw her party's history first and didn't vote for the Tories back in 2017, giving her less of a majority. That meant her MPs, who were voted into office because of her, had to disagree with any chance we could remain or leave depending on where they stood, because May was only offering either a soft Brexit, delaying Brexit, or a second referendum. May thought she could unite the country by demanding both Remainers and Leavers in her party submit to compromise. But they did not submit because they read between the lines and figured out that whatever they voted for was only going to lead to the opposite. Because of her, Brexit has attempted to go down all kinds of dead ends numerous times, most of which have been contradictory and confusing. Politicians only go down paths that are easy to sell, and her deal was the hardest sale in political history. The biggest contradiction from Theresa May being that because of her, Brexit means not leaving. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.